So 83% accuracy is apparently what you get when you stop counting proteins and instead start reading their shapes. Scripps Research published a blood test today that detects Alzheimer's not just by measuring how much amyloid or tau is floating around, but by examining how three ordinary blood proteins are folded, twisted slightly wrong, bent in ways that a healthy body doesn't produce. The proteins, they were always there, and the disease signal was always there, but nobody thought to look at the geometry of it. Now, the same day, University of Queensland researchers found that cells in people with depression aren't running low on energy the way everyone assumed. They're running hot, overproducing at rest, burning through their reserves before any stress even arrives. So the signal, again, was always present, but the framing was just backwards. So let's talk a bit about what that means when this limiting factor was never biology, but our perception. All right, so here's the landscape for today. Four of the largest technology companies on Earth, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and Apple, all filed legal briefs defending a competitor. And it's not because they like each other. It's because a designation the Pentagon slapped on Anthropic threatens the structural conditions under which any of them can operate. This is a governance event. Now, Nvidia also committed $26 billion over 5 years to build open AI models that anyone can use, and they released the most capable one yet, optimized for hardware it happens to sell. And also, sodium-ion batteries hit the Midwestern grid for the first time. A Tennessee utility deployed 29 megawatts of battery microgrids and is building towards 150. And the two medical papers I just mentioned a bit ago, they rewrite the diagnostic logic for two of the most widespread conditions in the world. So these huge things that are happening right now, what ties them all together isn't a theme, but a phase. Every one of these stories involves a system that was assumed to be settled. Who governs AI? What open source means at scale? What chemistry stores energy? How you detect disease? Discovering that the actual structure was different from what the incumbent framework described. Not wrong exactly, just a lower resolution than to what's now possible. So the coalition forming around Anthropic isn't just defending the one company. It's now the first time in history that the technology sector has collectively articulated in a federal courtroom that safety commitments must be commercially survivable or they'll disappear. Nvidia's open model bet isn't just a product launch, but it's the dominant hardware company right now, ensuring that every branch of AI research, that's language models, world models, and agentic systems, runs on its silicon by making the models themselves free. So it's a really sure bet. But the sodium ion pilot isn't just a battery. It's a second chemistry entering grid scale deployment, which means the grid is no longer locked to a single supply chain. And the disease research isn't just better tests. It's a new kind of signal. It's a new shape, not just quantity. Energy pattern, not energy deficit. So each of these separately is a good story, but together they describe a day when several load-bearing assumptions about how complex systems work got quietly replaced by higher resolution descriptions of the same reality. All right, let's talk specifically about the Anthropic coalition that is kind of forming right now. I want to be really specific about what has happened because that structure of all of them together really matters. It's far more important than any of the individual filings. Microsoft's amicus brief states a substantive position on the technology itself. Now, Microsoft, a defense contractor, an Anthropic investor, a company with billions in government cloud revenue, told the court that AI tools should not be used for domestic mass surveillance or to put the country in a position where autonomous machines could independently start a war. This is not legal boilerplate. This is a position on the record in federal court. And then there's the Chamber of Progress brief. You've got Google, Apple, Amazon, and Nvidia, competitors who sue each other in other courtrooms, signing a joint filing calling on the Pentagon supply chain risk designation a potentially ruinous sanction. And quoting directly, little more than a temper tantrum. And then 22 retired military officials, including a former CIA director, filed separately, arguing the designation is capricious retaliation that will deter any technology company from investing in national security. The administration was asked directly whether it would commit to not taking further action against Anthropic, and it refused. And reporting indicates that an executive order formally banning Anthropic across all federal agencies is being finalized as we speak. So let's hold this in view for a moment, because the shape of what's happening here is really important. The government is escalating, the private sector is consolidating, and the legal system, run by Judge Rita Lynn, who scheduled the preliminary hearing for March 24th, is being asked to mediate a confrontation that neither side is backing away from, and both sides are behemoths. So what's forming here is the first real stress test of how AI governance works when the stakes are existential for both sides. The government believes it needs unrestricted access to frontier AI capability for national security. The company and its unlikely coalition of supporters believe that if safety commitments can be punished, then no company will ever make them again. So what emerges from this won't be a compromise, it'll be a precedent. And precedents in the relationship between state power and transformative technology, they tend to echo for decades, even in this case when we've got such rapid change going on right now. So the question forming in that courtroom isn't really about Anthropic at all. It's about what kind of institutional architecture can hold together when the capability it's trying to govern is advancing faster than any governance system in human history has ever had to move. This is the new reality, and this is what we'll have to catch up to. All right, let's shift away here. Nvidia's $26 billion. Let's talk about that for a bit. Let me unpack why this is a different kind of open source bet than what we've seen before. Most open source AI releases come from companies that make their money on services, subscriptions, or API calls. So the model is free, but the business model depends on what surrounds it. So that's how they make their money. Now, Nvidia's incentive structure is fundamentally different here. Nvidia makes chips. The more people building AI and running AI and experimenting with AI, regardless of which model they use, the more chips they sell. Open models are, for Nvidia, the most efficient possible marketing for its hardware. So Nematron 3 Super has 120 billion total parameters, 12 billion active, and built on a hybrid architecture combining Mamba state space models with transformer attention. It's optimized specifically for Nvidia's Blackwell chips. And the release includes everything: weights, training data, infrastructure code, technical innovations, not just the finished product, but the recipe. So this is strategic depth. This is not just generosity. So DeepSeek reportedly trained a competitive model entirely on Huawei chips. If Chinese open models running on non-NVIDIA hardware become the global default, NVIDIA's dominance erodes, and they know that. So by releasing frontier quality open source models tuned to their own silicon, NVIDIA is making itself the path of least resistance for every researcher, startup, and enterprise building on open infrastructure. And there's something structurally interesting about what happens when the company that makes the substrate also makes the best tools running on that substrate. It creates this gravitational center. So you don't have to use Nematron 3 Super. But if you're already on NVIDIA hardware and a frontier quality model arrives pre-optimized for your chips with all the training methodology open so you can adapt it, then obviously that pull is significant. NVIDIA isn't just selling shovels anymore. It's building the mine, handing out the maps, and by the way, the shovels still work best underground. All right, let's shift away from that. Let's talk about the disease search. I want to dwell on this a lot here because I think the structural insight underneath these papers is one of the most important things happening in the life sciences right now. So the Scripps team's Alzheimer's test works by analyzing 3 blood proteins: C1qa, clusterin, and apoprotein B. So it's not really about how much of each of these is present. Rather, it's about how each is shaped. So the insight is that as Alzheimer's develops, the systems responsible for keeping proteins properly folded, proteostasis, degrades broadly. And that degradation leaves structural fingerprints in circulating blood proteins that are more informative than the concentration measurements the field has relied on for years. So 83% overall accuracy, over 93% when comparing 2 groups directly. It's validated across independent cohorts and reproducible months apart. That is a huge deal in this field. And then there's also the depression finding. So research at the University of Queensland looked at mitochondrial function in young adults with major depressive disorder and found exactly the opposite of what the standard model predicts. Cells in people with depression aren't energy depleted. They're overproducing ATP. at baseline. They're running at higher metabolic rate while resting, which means when the stress arrives and the system needs to ramp up, there's nowhere to go. The reserves are already spent. So think about that, what that means for intervention. If you assumed depression was an energy deficit, you'd try to boost production. All right, let's look at both of these papers together. They share a deeper architecture. The biological signal they're reading was always present. Proteins were always folding differently in people developing Alzheimer's. Mitochondria were always overperforming at rest in people with depression. The data was there in the blood the whole time, but what changed is that computational and experimental methods reached the precision needed to distinguish signal from noise. That's the power of the advances in technology that we have right now. This is what the generative era does to science. It's not new biology. This is new perception, and new perception applied to old data reveals structures that were invisible at the previous resolution. So the question that opens up, and it's staggering, is how many other conditions are carrying diagnostic signals in blood, in tissue, in cellular behavior that we simply haven't built the instruments to read yet? Today we got 2 of them, but tomorrow's number is going to be larger, and then larger, and then larger. Okay, let's look at how all this fits in the overall arc of the change that we're going through right now. So the Anthropic Pentagon arc has now produced the broadest coalition ever assembled around an AI governance question. So here's the accumulation. February 28th, 300 Google employees signed an open letter. And then on March 10th, 30 plus employees of rival companies, including Google's chief scientist Jeff Dean, filed a formal amicus brief. And today, the corporations themselves join. Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and Apple, alongside 22 former military officials. Open letter, employee declaration, cross-competitor amicus brief, corporate amicus brief, retired military amicus briefs. Each escalation draws a wider circle, and the government is still escalating in the other direction. So March 24th is the next inflection point. All right, let's talk about the energy diversification arc, because it also keeps adding new layers as we will track this arc over time. We started tracking distributed storage when New Orleans launched its virtual power plant in late February. Now, on March 4th, US battery deployments surged 29%. On March 11th, Base Power assembled 100 megawatts of residential batteries across a Texas cooperative at peaker plant scale, house by house. That was yesterday. And now today, sodium ion chemistry enters the meso grid, and the EPB of Chattanooga begins building towards 150 megawatts of distributed microgrids with adaptive boundaries controlled by Oak Ridge software. So each entry adds a new chemistry, a new deployment model, or a new control architecture. The grid emerging from this accumulation doesn't just have more storage, it has more ways to be resilient. And now let's go to the Alzheimer's diagnostic. This arc is converging from multiple independent angles. Washington University's plasma p-tau 217 blood test arrived in February. On March 9th, researchers identified the tanocyte pathway for tau clearance in the brain. And today, Scripps adds protein folding as a third independent signal. 3 different biological mechanisms, 3 different research groups, all pointing at the same destination, blood-based detection years before symptoms appear. So when 3 independent approaches converge on the same answer through different methods, that answer tends to be right. All right, let's shift to why I picked today's human voice. It's developmental biologist Michael Levin in conversation with Mayim Bialik on her podcast, Break It Down. So Levin's work sits at the intersection of everything the science stories today are pointing toward, and he's someone that I've admired for a really long time. He studies bioelectric signaling, the voltage patterns that cells use to communicate, coordinate, and decide what to become. His lab uses those signals to prevent tumors, erase birth defects, give organisms entirely new stable body plans. He does this not by editing genes, but by changing the conversation that is happening already between those cells. So he describes cancer as a breakdown in communication, cells that have lost contact with the body's shared information architecture. And he's shown that you can reconnect them, not by killing them, but by restoring that signal, which is the same principle the Alzheimer's and depression papers are revealing, but from a different angle. The information, again, was always there. The biology was communicating, but the limiting factor was our ability to listen. So the link's in the newsletter, definitely check it out. It's one of the most extraordinary conversations about what bodies actually are that I've ever heard. And again, I really admire Dr. Levin. He does a lot of amazing work. All right, let's talk a bit about what shipped today. So Nvidia's Nematron 3 Super. I talked about the strategic implications already, but let me give you the specs as a shipped product. 120 billion total parameters, 12 billion active, hybrid Mamba transformer, mixture of experts, 1 million token context window, 5 times higher throughput than the previous Nematron Super. Open weights, open trading data, open infrastructure code, available on Hugging Face right now. Now, they also shipped AIQ, which is a multi-agent deep research system that hit #1 on both deep research benchmarks. Perplexity also launched Personal Computer. This is slightly different than the Perplexity computer that they launched a little while ago here. This is a locally running AI agent on a dedicated Mac. It operates 24/7 with full access to your files and your apps. There's remote control, a complete audit trail, and a kill switch. So this is a post-Perplexity injunction product, the one that arrives after a federal judge told their last agent that it couldn't go shopping, right? So built-in governance features, action approval, accountability by design. That's a company learning from its own legal boundary in real time. And also Canva launched Magic Layers in its public beta, which is an AI feature that takes a flat image and breaks it into individually editable design components. So there's background, characters, text, objects, each on its own layer. It does that automatically, just from a simple JPEG. So if you do any visual design work, that's pretty awesome. A meaningful capability that wasn't available yesterday. All right, let's bring it home with the thread, everything that's going through here. Proteins fold differently in a person developing Alzheimer's. Mitochondria run hot in a person living with depression. Neither signal is new. Both have been present in every blood draw, every biopsy, every routine lab panel for decades. The instruments just couldn't see them. So I keep thinking about what else is already there. What other signals are sitting in the data that we've already collected, in systems we've already built, but waiting for the resolution to simply catch up? Because that's what today described across every domain. A governance coalition that was always latent, competitors who shared the same structural exposure but needed a specific threat to crystallize, a hardware company whose strategic position was always implying building models. It just needed the competitive pressure to make that investment. A battery chemistry that was always viable, but it needed manufacturing maturity and a grid willing to pilot it. All right, so very soon, let's watch for what happens on March 24th, when Judge Lin hears the Anthropic preliminary injunction. But also watch for what the sodium ion pilot data shows in its first weeks of operation, and watch for whether the protein folding diagnostic approach extends beyond these 3 proteins. Because if proteostasis degradation leaves signatures across many circulating proteins and not just 3, then what Scripps has built isn't a test, but a platform. Again, the signal was always there, but now we're learning to read it. All right, we'll see you tomorrow.